thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. I wanted to introduce our wonderful inspirational coordinator, the creator of this presentation and project, and general troublemaker, Carol Imani.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. I'm Carol Imani, and I'm pleased to be able to take part in this performance with my own little monologue, which I'm presenting to you right now. I'm feeling very proud and very happy. I'm proud of the 9 people whose stories you are about to hear. When I began this project, I thought I was looking for people who would tell compelling stories about the process of reentry after being in prison and educate you, our audience, about that. That will be happening today, but as I met with these 9 people, I began to understand that what we are doing here is something more. As I listened to each of their stories, holding my breath, feeling filled with awe about all they'd been through and overcome, and sometimes crying, I came to realize that although yes, they each do have a re-entry story, they also have deeper and more significant stories to tell you. Each of them, in part because of the intense hardships they have experienced, will be telling you about turning their lives around. So, although we do want you to leave today understanding more about why people commit crimes that get them in prison, and more about why prisons often aren't fit for human habitation, we also want you to feel moved, inspired, and uplifted about the possibilities of personal redemption. So, I'm very proud of these 9 strong, smart, resilient, courageous, and charming people. I'm so pleased to have met them, and I'm so honored to know them. And I am proud of our wonderful director, Chris Kirschmar, who, with unfailing tact, kindness, and theater know-how, helped all of us to prepare for today. And I'm proud of Beth Standish, our videographer, who brings talent, heart, and soul to her work. I'm proud of the Regional Arts and Culture Council for having the wisdom to fund this project. I'm proud of the First Unitarian Church and the social justice group within it, Ending the New Jim Crow, which has very graciously hosted the workshops in which the monologues were written, as well as hosting this performance. I'm proud of the volunteers who are helping out today, and I want to say a special thank you to Cassandra Sheffman in the church office, with whom I exchanged countless emails focused on the details for the writing workshops and this performance. I'm proud of all of you who, on a quiet Sunday afternoon in October, cared enough to come and hear these stories. And I'm proud of myself for dreaming up this project and getting it to this magical moment. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Chris.
Piper Kerman. Nothing about the daily workings of the prison system focuses its inhabitants' attention on what life back on the outside as a free citizen will be like. The life of the institution dominates everything. This is one of the awful truths about incarceration. The fact that the horror and the struggle and of your immediate life behind prison walls drives the real world out of your head. That makes returning to the outside difficult for many prisoners. We will now hear When the Universe Aligns Itself with You by Tyrone.
So, my clean date is May 10th of 2009. I use the word clean because I'm abstinent from all drugs and it includes alcohol. A little bit about my past. I'm from Pasadena, home of the Rose Bowl and the Tournament of Roses Parade. I come from a single-parent family, including my mother and my two brothers. We all have different dads, and we're several years apart. I'm the youngest, so I was often alone because what 18-year-old or 25-year-old wants to hang out with an 11-year-old? Pasadena is a really beautiful city, but let's not be fooled. It is also infested with a large gang population and drugs. At age 14, I was introduced to crack cocaine. I could still remember it made me feel whole. But I was not prepared for what was to come after. Multiple arrests and multiple stays at Sylmar Juvenile Hall, Los Padrinos Juvenile Hall, Central Juvenile Hall, Camp Afterball Detention Center, Challenger Youth Detention Center, Camp McNair Detention Center, Southern Youth Correctional Facility, Ventura Youth Correctional Facility, and Chino Youth Correctional Facility. You would think I would have learned, but the broken system was just preparing me for Tracy State Prison, Delano State Prison, Chino State Prison, and Tehachapi State Prison. There was no rehabilitation, and everybody I was in the juvenile system with, we all met up later on in prison. The prison system is broken, has always been broken, will always be broken, and it broke me. Federal data demonstrates this, but I've done nothing to fix it. So in 2009, I'm in Delano State Prison, and it's Black TV Day. Whites and Hispanics aren't supposed to mix, and everybody does everything separately. The only time you do see different races interacting is if there's tension or if it has to do with drugs. So a white guy named Joey came into the TV room where I was at alone and reaches out his hand to shake mine, and I hesitantly took his hand. He briefly let me know he did not like the racial politics in prison, and he grew up in Long Beach, California, where it was integrated, and his closest friends happened to be Black and Hispanics. So there in prison for the first time, I felt good because Pasadena was also an integrated city. That night when the lights went out in the dorm, Joey dropped the book off on my bed without nobody seeing. He said that it changed his whole perspective on life. I read this book. It was called The Secret, written by Rhonda Byrne, and featured numerous spiritual teachers from all walks of life. Out of all the years I spent in the prison system, reading tons of self-help books, this one made sense. I learned about the law of attraction, which says what you put out in the universe is what you get back. Even more powerful was the idea that if you change your thoughts to positive ones, putting yourself on a positive frequency, that the universe will align itself for you. On May 2009, I was released and given $200 and dropped off at the Bakersfield Greyhound Station, where I got a ticket to Portland. I'd never been to Portland, didn't know anything about Portland, but I do remember 7 years ago, somebody telling me that Portland was a nice place. So I had nothing to lose, either go to Portland or go back to downtown LA, Skid Row, where I was homeless and lived for many years using drugs. I was at the Greyhound station, I was waiting at the Greyhound station for the bus to arrive, and I went down to the street and bought a bottle of Parmesan. When I got back to the Greyhound station, I bought some marijuana from a young man sitting out there. I had no idea how not to use drugs at this time because I had been using for 15 years. Something powerful happened when I put these drugs in my body. All that I learned about the law of attraction, the positive thoughts, the goals, the amazing feeling in my heart vanished. I was immediately back to my old thinking, back on the streets, back in the prison mentality. But for some reason, I still got on that bus. 28 hours later, I was in Portland. And as I got off the bus, I looked to the sky and asked for help. Help me not get high, not help me find a shelter. Help me not get high, not help me find a job. Help me not get high, not help me find a girlfriend. Help me not get high, because that's all I wanted. Immediately, the universe started to work in my favor. My first night in Portland, a security guard at the Greyhound station let me stay there that night. But when morning came, I was gone. My second night, I met a Portland street person who let me sleep in the area of an abandoned parking lot. My third night, I traveled around downtown Portland observing everything. Asked somebody where I could find the nearest school. A guy told me to follow the park block south and I would hit Portland State University. I felt as though if I was on a college campus, I would be safe. So I made it to Portland State and hung out there. I was even able to get a password to the computer and go online and message people on MySpace because Facebook wasn't popping at that time. I went out to smoke a cigarette and I met two girls, Tamara and Crystal. I told them about my journey, that the journey I was on because of the book I read. I didn't tell them about my prison life or drugs, but I let them know that because I had read this book, I jumped on a Greyhound, landed in Portland to do something with my life. Tamara looked at me in shock, telling me I was crazy to do something like that. And when I didn't know anybody, Crystal, on the other hand, was crying. I asked her why. She said because her whole life she's been fed by a silver spoon and that her heart was ungrateful. She said I had an attitude of gratitude and I was happy about what was to come and I had nothing. They offered me to sleep on her couch that night. They probably think they just let this guy, stay at their place. But little do they know, they saved my life. The next day they took me to eat, and once again I was on my journey. Later that day, I was standing in front of a homeless shelter to get a shower when an older gentleman with a crack pipe and a bottle of alcohol asked me where I was from and if I used drugs. There was a silence. Then I told him where I was from and that every time I used drugs, I end up homeless or in jail. He recommended I go to treatment. I laughed inside because why would I take advice from somebody who's actively using? But I let him walk me 5 blocks down the street and he pointed out a treatment center to me. I walked into this place literally crying, telling them I didn't want to get high anymore. They asked me if I needed to go to detox, and I told them yes. And at the time, I didn't even know what detox was. I was assigned to somebody who took me to go eat, paid for me to stay in the shelter that night, and the next morning put me in a treatment program that took me to my first 12-step meeting at the Northwest Alamo Club. And I'm forever grateful for that person, Randy Servizio. I started going to recovery meetings on a regular basis, which helped me build community. I also was taken through some step work, which helped me understand my addiction. I was taken through some traditions, which taught me how to help my fellow man without judgment. And I was taken through some concepts that helped me understand the act of service. With all this, I was able to change my values and feel good in my own skin. That was over 8 years ago. I've been clean ever since. Long story short, I have a career in healthcare as a case manager in the clinic. I work with behavioral health patients and primary care patients. My relationship with my family is the best ever. I'm a single parent, and please don't ask me if I have legal custody, because you wouldn't ask a woman that. I own a home, I have real friends, and I'm working on a bachelor's in healthcare administration. But I would have, but none of this, but I would have none of this without the 12 steps, 12 traditions, and the 12 concepts, and taking action. But last but not least, a loving God of my understanding. This journey started with a rare moment of connection in prison between myself and a white guy. In the book he gave me, which could change my life. When I got to Portland, everything that was happening to me demonstrated that the universe was really willing to align itself for me because I had a willing heart. Thank you for listening.
Howard Zinn. I am convinced that imprisonment is a way of pretending to solve the problem of crime. It does nothing for the victims of crime, but perpetuates the idea of retribution, thus maintaining the endless cycle of violence in our culture. It is a cruel and useless substitute for the elimination of those conditions: poverty, unemployment, homelessness, desperation, racism, greed, which are at the root of most punished crime. The crimes of the rich and powerful go mostly unpunished. We'll now hear Surrender in a Box by Dawn.
Imagine a 6-year-old girl happily walking out of a store with a new toy. Since I was about knee-high to a grasshopper, not many people noticed me. With the purple elephant in hand, I calmly walked out of the store without paying a damn penny for it. At that moment, I felt a false sense of liberation from the poverty I'd faced. And I didn't have the faintest inclination that what I had done was a crime. For me, doing crime would become a way of life, growing up on the Umatilla Reservation near Pendleton in the 80s and 90s. After the purple elephant, I began to make my steady climb up the criminal ladder, and I graduated to stealing $1,000 bikes, high-quality pot, and my mom's car on a regular basis, all before I was a teenager in the early 90s. I quickly went from selling dope on the elementary playground to selling sex for dope to the local pedophile drug dealers at the tender age of 13. I was also violent because growing up I was treated abusively in many ways. Violence would drive the desire to gain my power back. Early on in my childhood, I had a fight to the death mentality. This would lead to violent run-ins in the name of self-defense. At age 15, I stabbed my drug dealer boyfriend in an attempt to get him to stop beating me. I was let off because it was considered self-defense. In 1998, I graduated to my first weapons charge for almost shooting my abusive boyfriend, who was just trying to stop me from another suicide attempt. I was looking at a possible 12 years in prison if they were able to upgrade my charges. but any further wrongdoing was unable to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. My criminality would only progress as I got older. The statistics on the levels of crime, violence, addiction, sexual abuse on the reservations very much surpassed the national average, and I experienced all of that firsthand. At an early age, I had survived many of the horrors that are sadly common on reservations like the one I grew up on. Having lived through so much of that, I made my first suicide attempt at 12. I went to my first adolescent residential treatment center also at 12. And I was brutally raped at 12. All of this was the perfect recipe for gut-wrenching despair. I felt as if oppression ran so deep in the land that it seemed like it was in the ground. Ultimately, my criminal behaviors became a way of life to feed an out-of-control drug and alcohol habit. At the time, I was a newly birthed heroin addict with the relentless hunger to use, even though I cried whenever my boyfriend would stick the needle in my arm. At age 23, I was jumping in and out of cars with nothing more than a bikini and a tube top used as a skirt. I regularly got beat by my abusive boyfriends and have been in many fights. I've been beaten, stabbed, raped, shot at, kidnapped, and lied to more times than you can imagine. All of those were supposed to be the best years of my life. But all of that changed when I was arrested on March 5th, 2014. I overdosed in front of my daughter, Deja, who was just 3 years old. The overdose led to a near-death experience in which all I wanted was to see Deja one last time. All of a sudden, my eyes opened. I looked up and saw people surrounding me who seemed to be 15 foot tall and perhaps angels. But these angels ended up being the tribal police, the tribal emergency medical technicians, and the FBI. The EMTs shuffled me away to the hospital as my little girl was whisked away by a Department of Children and Family Services caseworker. By 1 p.m., I was booked into the Umatilla County Jail. I had managed to overdose, be hospitalized, lose custody of Deja, and go to jail in a record 3-hour period. The aftermath left me alone, on my knees, and with a river of tears streaming down my face. I knew that I was tired of being a slave to heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, and alcohol. But how could I break free? I had seen my dad, Daryl, suffer from the same vicious cycle, and I knew some of his demons had become mine too. My real prison was criminality, drug addiction, alcoholism, violence, poverty, and prostitution. I felt like I would eventually die with a needle in my arm, and I wondered if society had created a monster. Maybe so, but I also knew the only person I could hold accountable was myself. If I could choose one word to describe what was most instrumental to my reentry, what word would that be? What did it take to break down the walls that kept me prisoner? That one word would be surrender. That's because all of my life I have been trying to escape all the ways in which reservation life had hurt me. with angry and defiant behaviors. Trying not to surrender to all of that pain, I used all kinds of drugs and drank, committed criminal acts, including prostitution, to pay for my using, and acted violently to assert myself. But what had that resulted in for me? I finally understood that all I had done was put myself into horrible consequences. And now I found myself literally in a box, a jail cell, having almost died, and all but lost my daughter. So I had to finally be willing to surrender to all those behaviors, walk away from them, and find the power in myself to free myself from the box. And that's what I began to do. I gave up all the illegal activities I once adamantly participated in on a daily basis. I had to believe that something greater was working in my life. So in faith, I took a spiritual leap and let go. By sifting through all the hopelessness, I found a timelessly beautiful type of hope that never really dies. So although I was beaten and broken, by surrendering, I was able to begin changing my life. I knew that I meant it when one day my paths crossed with a police officer. And though there were no charges against me, I immediately raised my hand and said, "I surrender." He was amused and confused, but he seemed to understand what I was really saying. The road I travel today is much different than the one from which I disembarked. In recovery, I stepped into a whole new world with unfamiliar rules. If I wanted to make it in this world, I had to adapt. A life without crime meant getting a legal job. A life without drugs meant learning how to live without using them, which was so hard because I was fighting against my own nature, having such a strong inclination to use. A life without violence meant learning how to deal with my anger in a healthier way. At times, the answer to my problems was simply doing the next right thing, by putting one foot in front of the other, by breathing, and by not giving up. My surrender truly began on April 4th, 2014, when I stayed at Central City Concerns Hooper Detox for 14 days. During that time, I helped get my newly detoxed body into the Native American Residential Treatment Center outside of Portland. After 4.5 months there, with the help of the Sarah Oxford House, I was able to move to sober housing. The hardest battle was jumping through the hoops of the reunification plan Tribal Department of Children and Family Services required of me to get my daughter back. It included going to court, finding stable housing, and a decent job, all while staying sober. I had a whole slew of monsters to defeat, and it would prove to be the most strenuous, stressful challenge I had faced. But I could see the silver lining around the clouds for the first time. I was truly changing. And with the help of my tribal lawyer, after 2 years of struggle, I did finally get custody of my daughter, Deja, again. I wish that I could have taken my friends with me on this journey. When I visited the Reservation Agency Cemetery, I gently placed my 1-year coin down on a friend's grave who had died from a heroin overdose. The other challenge I had faced is becoming self-sufficient. And though I had a flagging job, I am still unable to be self-supportive due to the seasonal nature of construction work. At the same time, though, I have been able to be blessed by being able to work towards complete independence with the help of the Washington County Housing Yes program. And I've also participated in work source programs such as the Health Careers Northwest program and the Work Experience program and the Prisoner Reentry program. With this help, I am going back to school to become a dental assistant. My goal is to work for the NARA Dental Clinic someday, since they have been such an instrumental part of my recovery. The WEX program has also helped me to gain employment at the Bridges to Change as a certified recovery mentor. One day, I hope to return to the reservation and create my own mentor program for those who need support in the recovery reentry process. Nothing means more to me than gaining back physical custody of my daughter Deja, who is now 7. The weighted down face of sadness she once wore is now replaced with laughter and smiles. But the greatest miracle is the little girl I once was, now grown into a woman, has continued to beat the odds since April 5th, 2014, in learning how to surrender, to change, to leave behind the person I am, day by day, week by week, year by year, becoming the person I was meant to be. I cannot be put in a box. Thank you.
Megan Sweeney, solitary confinement is terrible. You're in a grave. You can't do anything. Everything's brought to you and you're in a room all day except to come out of the showers. You're in a grave and you're trying to live. That's how best to describe it. You're in a grave. You're trying to live because you're not dead yet. But nobody hears you when you call out, "Hey, I'm alive." This is I Want You to Imagine This by Joseph.
I'm going to try to stand still for this, I'm just saying. I remember getting out of Oregon State Penitentiary and taking some deep breaths. I don't know if you realize, but freedom has a smell, a crisp, refreshing smell. I remember the excitement as my mom, my sister, and my grandma were standing there waiting for me. I was carrying bags full of property, walking up to my family and giving them hugs. I remember the sense of overwhelming freedom, knowing that I had survived a nightmare. I don't even know how to describe it to you, but I knew then that I never wanted to go back to prison, not ever. My recovery is based on the fact that I refuse to go to prison ever again. I don't want to spend another second in prison. I'm not sure people understand the mental issues that come from years of incarceration. I didn't even believe in it, in mental health, until this last prison trip. I would watch all these guys in prison talk about things like voices in their heads, the anxiety of being around crowds of people, and depression. But I did experience firsthand the challenges of solitary confinement. In Oregon prisons, there is a program called intensive management, which is a type of solitary confinement. Somewhere it was decided that it was a good idea to put people in lockdown for 24 hours a day, take away everything away from them, and force feed them packets about thinking and behavior errors. They forgot that maybe a teacher or a mentor would be helpful in moving people in the right direction. Instead, they just throw these packets at you and they expect you to read them and learn on your own. I was fortunate enough to know how to read and write and comprehend, but not everyone could. For months on end, I was forced to live in a rectangle about 8 feet wide, 9 feet long, and a ceiling just out of reach. Day after day, sometimes night after night, I'd listen to the guys in the cells around me, screaming their lungs out, banging their cups, and tapping their toothbrushes on my walls, trying to make sure I could never sleep, playing this mental warfare game, because some of them were mad or upset or hurt. I remember when I got out of prison, the cars would make so much noise, zoom! The noises were so intense and loud, the colors so vivid and bright, they were like enhanced by steroids. When we got into town, my sister, she took me to shopping. I walked into Burlington Coat Factory, and people were everywhere. I mean, all around me, and my hands started to sweat. My heart started to beat. My senses were on full alert as an overwhelming feeling of panic and paranoia set in. My sister said, "Men clothes are that way. Go grab some pants and a couple shirts." I looked at her as if she was crazy, and I tried to force myself to concentrate. Shoot, I didn't even know what size pants I wore anymore. I mean, for so long, my pants choices were small, medium, or large, washed, dried, and delivered to my door 3 times a week. Then she told me to go get a belt. I somehow found the belt rack. I got lost in the names and the sizes and colors, but I remember her yelling over, "Just pick one!" It's funny to me now, but in prison, our items are wrote down on a piece of paper and sent into commissary and delivered to us. I did so much solitary confinement that it messed with my head, with my brain. I didn't know how to act around people, and I wasn't able to feel comfortable in public places, let alone my own skin. They don't tell you that they will be caging you up like an animal and taking away all human contact, except for those on your tier. They don't tell you about the dysfunctional correctional officers that treat you like you don't matter. I once heard a correctional officer telling a guy a couple cells down that he was worthless and that he should take a sheet, wrap it tightly around his neck, do the world a favor, and kill himself. But these are the people the community entrusts with lives that matter. But all lives matter, even the ones in prison. They consider us the incurables because they think there is no hope for us. But I am here to tell you there is hope. I stand in front of you with over 5 years clean, a man in recovery, a man in long-term recovery. I set goals and I accomplished them. I continue becoming a productive member of society. I'm a certified recovery mentor for a company that works with men and women in the criminal justice system. My company believes that recovery is a solution, and there is hope for people condemned as statistics. I work with people that have the opportunity to get on their feet and learn to not use drugs or alcohol and become stable in society. Most of these people don't even know what recovery is, and I get to be a part of their process, whatever that looks like. Some of these people are living on the streets, chasing their tails, talking to themselves like zombies, looking for their next fix. I get to play a role in these individuals coming back to life. I didn't understand what my life was going to look like when I got out of prison. I used to lay there with my head on my pillow, staring at the wall and the ceiling. listening to people yelling and screaming because they had given up hope. I would dream of what my next steps would look like once I stepped out that gate. I found hope in building good habits. I started reading the Narcotics Anonymous books and different beliefs about God. I started working out on a regular basis, and I found a couple friends in it too. During one of my trips to intensive management unit, I found a vent in the back of my cell. I mustered up the courage one night, stepping up to my cold metal toilet. "Hello," I yelled. Surprisingly, after a couple attempts, someone answered back. Truthfully, I didn't know if it was the man in the cell underneath me or if it was God finding me in the deepest, darkest times of my life because I was desperate for a friend. Day after day, night after night, I spoke to that person through the vent, and we even conducted 12-step meetings, each of us standing on our toilets, reading the AA Big Books while drinking coffee. That gave me hope and the drive to not quit. So if I could tell you one thing, it's that there's hope in the darkest places, but it takes us to be the light. We need to shine that light on others by saying that we believe in them. When was the last time someone said to you, "Hey, I believe in you, and I know you can do something with yourself"? I am doing something with myself. I continue moving forward. I don't know what 5 years will look like. I don't know what 10 years down the road will look like. But I know I need to keep doing what I am doing today, going to meetings, building relationships with people that aren't zombies, who are doing something with their lives. And that's what gives me the fighting chance. They say if you want to know where you'll be at in 5 years, look at the people you surround yourself. The people you surround yourself with. If you hang out with knuckleheads, you're going to be a knucklehead. So I stopped hanging out with knuckleheads. For so long, what I thought I knew got me in trouble. So I have had to learn how to be open-minded to what life can teach me, what the people around me can teach me. One reason I stay sober is because my mom, she calls me. She says, "Joseph, will you give me a ride to the store tomorrow? I just need to grab 5 things." "Oh, sure, 5 things." I roll my eyes. And instead she fills the shopping cart full, and it takes over an hour and a half. I laugh about that and sometimes act frustrated, but honestly, I look forward to every moment of it. It's a blessing to be a part of my family today, a blessing to be there for my sister and my grandma, who we call Granny Goose. I grew up in the middle class, and truthfully, I can't even say that. My family struggled to survive. My mom had 2 jobs, and my stepdad was a roofer who sold pot to make a couple extra bucks. My father died in California prison when I was 13 years old. And even though my family was middle class, I grew up in a house of addicts. I remember sitting in my mother's house, slaying, tossing drugs out the window with my sister at our customers. Shoot, Mom was getting high back then too. I chose to run away around the same time my father died and started running the streets. I got arrested for the first time at the age of 16. Went to prison for my first trip at 19. I'm 33 years old, and I've done over 7 years in prison and a couple years here and there in county jail. That's over a third of my life spent inside. The amends I owe my community are immense. No words can ever repay the families I hurt through my criminality. I hope my actions will forever be my living amends. What did it take for me to change my ways? Well, I had to get sick and tired of being sick and tired. But when that happened and I was finally ready, I had a tribe there for me with open arms, my recovery tribe. to accept me for all my mistakes, lift me up, dust me off, and give me room to grow and succeed. So although some of us did numerous years in prison and institutions, please don't count us out. We're part of your communities. We're your neighbors, your co-workers, and we want to be your friends. We want you to be able to depend on us, to count on us, to follow through with our word. We're parents, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, nephews, nieces, and cousins. We're just like you, except that we chose different paths growing up, some not by choice. I've been lucky because I didn't die like my father did. I didn't overdose like my friend did about 6 months ago. I haven't had to do a life sentence, and I still have some marbles, so I count my blessings. When you leave here today, the next time you see someone standing on the corner, don't just look away, but think, that person can be someone. I'm not saying break bread with him and give him every dollar in your pocket, but give him a little smile, a little nod, and tell him that you believe in him. Because hearing that from the right person at the right moment can make you believe in yourself. And sometimes it's hearing it over and over and over and over that finally makes it click. And do believe in us. And don't let a bad apple ruin the whole tree. I believe in you. I believe that you are good-hearted people because you came here today to listen to us. And I couldn't have done any of this without the help of those that believed in me. So let's believe in one another. Thank you for coming to listen to us today.
Mark Lamont Hill. Prison is the only form of public housing that the government has truly invested in over the past 5 decades. Fyodor Dostoevsky. The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. This is The Iron Worker by Crystal.
Hello. My monologue has changed today, and the reason for that is my uncle, my family member. We recently lost him, so today I'm going to speak from my heart. I am firstborn generation here in the United States, and for some of you who don't understand what that means, my father is from Mexico, and my mother is from the United States. So there are 2 strong cultures running through my blood. And because of those 2 cultures growing up, my home became very difficult. My mom became very physically and emotionally abusive to me and my siblings. By age 11, I started running away. At the age of 14, I moved here to Portland with a family member whose home was full of love, but a love that I did not understand how to receive. Very quickly, within 6 months' time, I ran into a man who was 10 years older than me and quickly pulled me into the lifestyle of prostitution, and not by choice. By the age of 17, I became pregnant with his child and gave birth. Shortly after that, I was trying to leave him in the abuse, and that's where I found myself on the streets of Portland with a trick, whose vehicle that I got into, he was high on drugs and drunk on alcohol. He kidnapped me and forced me into his apartment, where I quickly tried to defend myself to get away. I grabbed an alcohol bottle and hit him over the head, thinking that he would pass out and I could leave. Unfortunately, he got up and told me he was going to kill me. I reached for the next thing close to me, which was a pan, and I hit him until he stopped moving, and fled. 3 days later, I was arrested and quickly told that this man had passed away. The district attorney and the court system did not know what charges to charge me with, so I spent the next 2 years in county jail at the age of 19, awaiting what was going to happen with the rest of my life. I went through court processes, and the state of Oregon has what is called mandatory minimum sentencing. Because of that, the day that I was sentenced, my judge said if Oregon had self-defense, she would not be sending me to prison for the next 16 and a half years of my life. I had those next 16 and a half years to remember those words. When I arrived in prison, I was very angry at the world, felt like my life was over, and attempted suicide many times. By the grace of God, my life did not end. Within the first 5 years, I got sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I started asking to take classes. I started asking for programs to learn. I had 2 family members that came to visit me every weekend. My father, Ismael Magana, and my cousin Alice. The rest of my family on my father's side had a very hard time coming to the prison because in Mexico, prison is different. When a family member goes there, you know that you leave them there to die, that there is no more after that. But my father came every weekend and gave me strength and told me, just keep going, don't give up, keep going. And when I say that I fought for classes, prison tells you they offer this program, like to learn how to be a carpenter or how to learn how to think different. But what they don't tell you is the amount of people that go into those classes is 1/4 of the population. And for those that get to go in, we have to fight. I had to beg, I had to write letters, and fight to get into those things. And as the years went on, I started to gain my voice back through volunteers that would come in with church programs, with Native services. There was 2 amazing women, Trish Jordan and Tana Sanchez, that would come in for our sweats, where I gained an understanding of love, of Creator's love for all of us. And that we're strong people, and our blood, we're strong, and we don't give up no matter what happens. And I had many staff members in the prison who were entrusted with our lives to encourage us and to strengthen us, who told me to be quiet, your voice isn't good, you're only going to come back here, we'll see you again in your prison blues and your state identification number. Well, those things made me angry, and instead of my anger turning to quitting, it forced me to fight harder and stronger, which is what I did. Some of the programs that I took these officers forced me into, were becoming an apprentice beekeeper. And I'm like my dad. You throw something at me, I'm going to make the most of it. I'm going to add each brick you throw my way, and I'm going to add mud to it. I'm going to build a wall, and I'm going to build my wall out of this place. Those bees and the strength of that hive, and many, many bees listening to one strong voice, they build and survive. And that's what my family does. And that's the bloodline that I come from. So I learned from those bees. And when they threw me in to become a wildland firefighter, I thought, this is crazy. But I went out there and I did that hard work, and I looked around at me at nature, and I looked at the things that God created and the blessings around me. And I thought, this is why I'm here. My family is here for these things. And I made the most. What they meant to destroy me, I turned around into blessings. As I came near the end of my incarceration, I lost 2 family members. My grandfather, who I'm just as close to as my dad, and my grandmother. In prison, they don't let you grieve. You don't have a service. You don't have the opportunity to spend time with family. They throw you in a wall, in a room that's just walls, nothing else. And they tell you go in there, scream, cry. You have a couple hours, and then you need to just calm it down, put it in a box on the shelf, and go on as if it never happened. Right before I got out, Trish Jordan, through Native Services, brought in the Oregon Women in Trades Pre-Apprenticeship Program, which is for women. Any woman. It doesn't matter if you've been to jail or prison, or if you're out here in the community and you decide you want to try something different. And I became very interested. I like to work hard with my hands. And growing up, my dad said, you work hard with your hands. The only good dollar is the one that you work hard for, and it's honest dollar. And I look up to my dad, and I want my dad to be proud of me, and I thought, I'm going to do this. So I went through that program, and I paroled on June 27th, 2016. And within a week, I started the pre-apprenticeship program, which is the first step to entering any trade. And when I say a trade, I'm speaking of iron workers. An iron worker, we build a skeleton of any building that you're sitting in, any building that you walk through. The carpenters who do all the woodwork, there's cement masons, there's many trades. And after I completed that, I got direct entry into Northwest Local 29 Iron Workers. But that was only the first step. I had to go through what they call Hell Week. And Hell Week is you have to carry 80 pounds of rebar, 30 laps of a city block and back. You have to climb 14 feet up in the air on a beam, and then walk the length of a beam, which is 14 feet long. And you learn to tie knots proficiently and tie iron rebar together proficiently. If you can show that you pass all of that, then you're in. But during that time, I knew that I needed to work and start gaining wages. And before I paroled, I was able to go into the community and go to Southeast Workforce Center, where I met an amazing woman, Cindy Pollard, who, through the re-entry program for formerly incarcerated people, helped me to get my gear, my work clothing, to work as a flagger. And she was there to support me, and at one time I remember I didn't know if I was gonna get called for a job or not, and I didn't know who to go to. I came down to her office without an appointment, and she sat with me and I cried because I thought like giving up, and she was there to encourage me. And we made a phone call, and they just forgot to call me, and I went to work the next day. From there, once I had completed the Iron Workers Hell Week, they called me to begin my first job on December 19th. Now, for someone who comes from incarceration, and someone like myself who was charged with manslaughter in the first degree, you're told and you learn to believe that you will never go and work for someplace big. You'll never work someplace where they have a lot of security, or that there's a lot of protected information. But my God is bigger than that. And the job site that I went to was down in the Dalles, and it was to build for Google, their next place that just opened up. And it was an amazing feeling. It was like a dream, because that somebody like me and everything that staff in prison told me, that shouldn't have happened. Unfortunately, a couple weeks after I started, there was an accident on the job, and me and one of my coworkers were crushed by iron. And when I say crushed by iron, each beam that we lay on the ground and prepare to be hoisted up by the cranes to be connected weighs between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds. Something happened, went wrong, and a domino effect of 5 beams came down on me and my partner. By the grace of God, neither one of us lost legs, but both of us are badly injured. And at this current time, I'm unable to work. I've been out of work since April. But I'm able to receive, because it's a work injury, wages, which allows me not to be worried about money right now. But the bigger thing is, just recently my uncle, at the age of 51, Joel Magana, out of the blue, passed away. And first he was in the hospital. And had things been different, had I not right away went through these programs and went to work, I wouldn't have been in the position today to be able to be there for my cousin Hedda and his brother Johnny and their mom, my Aunt Leisha, and the rest of my family, to be there to support and to encourage them, and to be able to do whatever I can to help them. And this, being able to be out here with my family, you know, while I was in prison for all those years, you feel alone. You have many people around you, but you feel alone. And when you get out, you feel like an alien, you know, and you've come to this weird country, right? And even though I had my family, I felt disconnected. But through this hard time that we're going through right now, I've realized that I do have family, and I'm reconnected with my family on a deeper level. I'm home. In my heart, I know that I am home. And today, I stand here before you a year and a half after incarceration. And thanks to all of my family, my friends, the people through volunteer services and programs both inside the prison and out here. I am a part of your community. I am your neighbor. Today, I am no longer a SID member. I am no longer a victim. I am a survivor. I am Crystal Magana. I am living on life's terms. I am an apprentice iron worker for Northwest Local 29. I am a taxpayer. I pay my own bills proudly. I own a car and a truck. I have my own place. And to those who said I wouldn't accomplish this, it's because of those very words that I am succeeding, and I will be back inside Coffee Creek Correctional Facility, but not in prison blues, but to encourage and strengthen and inspire those women and my sisters that are still inside to gain their voice and their freedom. And their freedom back. I am the daughter of Ismael Magana, and as a Magana we rise. It has been a long, hard road, a lot of tears and frustration, but I will never give up. Thank you.
Brian Stevenson, we have a choice. We can embrace our humanness, which means embracing our broken natures and the compassion that remains our best hope for healing. Or we can deny our brokenness, forswear compassion, and as a result, deny our own humanity. This is Still Being by Isabel.
I am not a shock factor. Although by popular opinion, I think that's what this life turned out to be. I went through 2 long years in prison for things I wouldn't have dreamt of doing years before they happened. I was a heroin addict. I bought and used and sold the drug. In fact, I don't think I really understood what I was getting into before I was arrested and incarcerated. 6 months of use and then shipped into the system for 3 years. I'll start out by saying I'm very grateful for it. I infinitely prefer the effects of prison to the effects of being dead. But it isn't until now, since I've been released, that I see how the structure of such a place has changed my soul. I went into Coffee Creek without hope. I didn't think I had been heard by my lawyer, nor by the district attorney. It had all happened so quickly. I just turned 21 5 days before my arrest. A sentence of 38 months had little meaning and rang hollow in my ears. I was so afraid of my next step, I didn't dare think of anything past it. It's just like anything else I've done in life, I thought. It's just another challenge. But there's something infinitely perturbing about going into a place where others tell you how to live your life, not to give you a sense of meaning, but by drilling in a rote set of patterns tailored to the institution. It starts out with the small, the minute, the wouldn't even think about it till it happened. Don't get off your bed until you're told. Okay, I can do that. And you can't brush your teeth until the lights turn on. But I just woke up. No hygiene until 6 a.m. Okay. Time to go get your lunch. Okay. Not you, segments A and B only. Your segment C, listen up. Okay. Are you getting an attitude with me? Address officers with respect at all times. Okay. This isn't even the narration of a full day, let alone my first day, let alone the other 790 of them. I learned a lot of things in prison, but I was mainly encouraged to see the world and myself as directly under the influence, the power of somebody else. It's a very fear-based way to live, and being out here in what we consider to be the real world, I sometimes feel myself being so very different. Awkward and more uncomfortable in myself than I used to be, I felt aware of something I think I'm missing. I wait for someone to tell me what it is, but then I realize I'm not in prison any longer. No one is here to tell me what I'm doing wrong. First, I notice I don't know how to eat. I used to go out and I wouldn't understand how to make basic decisions for myself, like how much food to put on my plate, or what makes a reasonable food group, and what time of day I get hungriest. When someone feeds you 3 times a day at predictable times, it starts to erode your sense of yourself. You don't have options, so your body assimilates to that reality. Take away these guardrails, and you enter into a sort of shock. When I got my first job after prison, I remember spending time around my coworkers and feeling this self-consciousness. Sometimes they would go out to eat together after work, and although part of me longed to join and have a group of people to be with, I inevitably evaded their invitations with hurried excuses, because I knew I had a 10 p.m. curfew to return to, and an hour's ride by bus to get there. I was living in a halfway house, as people call them. I never felt like I could talk about it. I felt like there was some shameful part of myself I was trying to hide, because goodness knows it isn't an easy thing to talk to people about being in prison. You're either a tragic story or a you deserved it, but very rarely a human being. These last 10 months have been a slow, thorough, and painful healing from what I felt to be a disfiguring scar. I'm unlearning so many things I swallowed without thought just to survive. I've had to learn to do life all over again, and I needed this rewiring. I needed to learn how the decisions I was making were hurting me and came from a pained place and were not beneficial. But I can't emphasize enough the displacement created by leaving a place like Coffee Creek. I think sometimes people associate paroling with an innate resolution, as if your experience is now at an end. But in a very real way, the effects of prison really begin only after you leave its walls. Within them, you're conditioned. Someone provides for you, gives you shelter, food, and a certain level of physical, if not emotional, safety. But after 2 years of this, I come out here and I don't know how to think. After 2 years of only rarely being able to hug or touch another human being, All I want is to be held by someone I love who loves me. After 2 years of having limited choices, I don't know what I like. After 2 years of sleeping in a room with 170 other women, being around people is uncomfortable. What else has been etched into me by this experience, I can't say. It's coming out slowly over time like little bits of gas leaking out of a pressure gauge. And it is ultimately my responsibility to surmount these obstacles and figure out what's realistic in my own life. This is not about who's at fault for creating these obstacles, nor is it even about what's right or wrong. This is about looking at what's really happening. And that means looking at how ballot measures and the officials we elect shape the lives of the justice involved. The public does have some power to change what prison is like, but that will only happen if we decide, as a society, that we want to see something different. This will be my first true Oregonian fall. This will be the first time I get to see the leaves change colors, the patterns they form on the ground, and the swirling, moving mixture of city grit and nature blended into one. It's beautiful, and there are no other words for it. But behind every glimpse of beauty I see in my world, there's a subtle realism that tells me someone can take it away. When I was 4 years old, I went through severe sexual abuse by someone I knew well. I blacked out most of my childhood, but I grew up with this disquiet, this rage, this depression that I did not know what to do with. I grew up, in a few short words, without hope that life would be any different. I was foolish to believe the things that brought me to prison, but I remember what it was like not to be seen for who I was and why I was making those decisions. I was confused and lost and wished for nothing more in the whole world than to be seen for the little girl who was mourning her losses within me. And so I worked to become ever more increasingly aware of the privileges I now have in life, although part of me remembers the others I was imprisoned with, remembers those who haven't yet had this taste of life. And the one thing that strikes me, the one thing I work the hardest to do, is rather than pass judgments on anyone, is to see them as human, making mistakes, and going through the experiences they need in life to grow. We go through so much trauma as it is in life. There's no need to add to it. There is no need to blame or victimize or create needless suffering for ourselves because out of desperation, we made the wrong choice. We all go through these paths. So it is my hope as more and more people are seen through the lens of their stories that we will learn to cultivate compassion and nonviolence rather than punishment and wrongdoing. No one is wrong at heart. We only choose the wrong paths until we learn to see the world for ourselves.
Oscar Wilde, I never saw a man who looked with such a wistful eye upon that little tent of blue which prisoners call the sky. Babar Ahmad, prison has taught me that there is a part of you that no one can ever take from you, and that is your heart. From Adam Gopnik, a prison is a trap for catching time. It isn't the horror of the time at hand, but the unimaginable sameness of the time ahead that makes prisons unendurable for their inmates. The basic reality of American prisons is not that of the lock and key, but that of the lock and clock. Reagan Butcher. Prison is like a high school with knives. We will now hear from James with Healing the Split.
Growing up, I never knew my parents. I was raised by my grandparents until 7 years old, when my grandmother passed away. I have two older brothers, Keith and Sean. At that time, we were placed in separate group homes. I was in a younger facility due to my age. I would see them from time to time during outings or when our families came to visit. We were separated for about 1.5 years. We were all then placed in a foster home with a single mother who had two children of her own, Rick and Tamiko. Adjusting to these changes was difficult for me. I was confused, afraid, I felt unwanted and depressed. This came out in aggressive behavior. I turned to stealing as we were poor. I fought a lot and I isolated from others. Rebellion became the norm for me, and adults, particularly my foster mom, my aunts, uncles, and teachers were my main targets. I didn't trust them in anything they told me, so I did the opposite. I was angry and resentful. School was a place where I felt disdain, particularly learning about the civil rights movements and the violence towards people of color. The inferior images the system placed upon Black people for fighting for basic human rights upset me a lot. How does a 10-year-old deal with the scars of abandonment, unworthiness, and fear? How do you cope with that? For me, I connected with people who felt the same as I did, committed to protect one another, support one another, and ultimately raise each other. We became family. Society labeled us as a gang. We took care of each other. Our means of surviving was to hustle. We stole from stores, sold drugs to get the things we wanted. We also used drugs and alcohol, and by age 14, I was placed in my first inpatient treatment. I completed that in 90 days and returned home. My performance was better in school. I was a good student when I applied myself. There were periods of praise and I excelled at sports, particularly basketball. Getting good grades and positive attention in sports gave me and my family great pride. This lasted for about 6 months, and at age 15, I was sent from Minneapolis to live with an aunt, my Aunt Sandy and my cousin Cassie here in Portland, Oregon. I was enrolled at Grant High School. Again, school improved, and I became a standout on the basketball team. In 1988, we won a state basketball championship. That was my junior year. I was receiving praise from colleges, getting many letters, even considered pretty highly ranked on the West Coast, as I was number 10 at that time. I was on the threshold of one of the greatest accomplishments in my life. 3 months later, I was arrested in Portland's first gang-related drive-by shooting that resulted in a death. I was remanded to adult court and eventually convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 20 years. How could a person with so much potential be involved in a situation where another person who looks just like them, after all the things we learned in school about how people looked at us, viewed us, commit a crime where this person lost his life? I did have a gun at the time and I did shoot. It was not my bullet, and for that I'm grateful. I stand here today in his memory and his honor, and for many people who have fallen due to the gang violence from all walks of life. During my incarceration, I went to substance abuse treatment, enrolled in barbering school, and got my GED. I also took college courses for a year. With 6 other inmates, I started an at-risk youth prevention program called Detour. It's an acronym that stands for Don't Take Our Unfortunate Route. Similar to Scared Straight, the difference is that we gave people a real look into the consequences of our behavior and decisions. I was also involved in the typical prison lifestyle. I continued to smoke marijuana, got into multiple fights which landed me in solitary confinement, also known as the hole. I was living two lives. There is this version of me with low self-esteem and fear, wearing a mask of violence, drug abuse, and narcissism. Then there's another version of me living a life of compassion for others, empowering others, being loving and caring. In 1998, I was released after serving 10 years. I returned to live with my aunt, found a job, and met a woman and started a family. But life was dysfunctional for about 9 years. The two versions of myself were convoluted in my mind, and I continued to use drugs, which resulted in 5 more treatment attempts, followed by periods of success. Eventually, though, I returned to prison in 2006 for 3 years for a robbery. I was broken and I needed help. I wasn't eligible for any programs, so I attended 12-step meetings and read books. I was released in 2009 and returned back to that same dysfunctional family that I had created. At this time, I had 2 daughters, Jasmine, who is now 20, and Jamaisha, who is 17. I wanted to do good, and at times I did. I just couldn't sustain it. Eventually, I returned to using drugs. I was on parole, and I was subjected to random urine analysis. My parole officer would give me parole violations for drug use, as well as hanging with known gang members. During one appointment with my PO, she offered to connect me with a mentor. I asked what a mentor is and what do they do. She said that mentors are people who used to be in the system, but are now productive members of society. She said he would help me find work, housing, and support me. I declined, and life continued to spiral downward. Something changed about 4 months later. I was using crack cocaine, marijuana, and alcohol for 3 days, and I could not get high. I could not escape the fact that I was a deadbeat dad, had thrown away a potential professional career as a basketball player, definitely a free education. I was desperate. I went to an appointment to see my PO and asked for help. She offered inpatient treatment at a county facility. I accepted. She also gave me 10 days for violation. I finished the violation and went directly into treatment from jail. I was relieved. I was applying myself in treatment. I began to challenge my belief system. During treatment, I looked at life honestly and took responsibility for my past decisions. Connected to that treatment was a mentor. We finally had an opportunity to talk. He told me how he had changed his life, how he used to be an outlaw, and I related to that story. I was inspired by how he changed. He told me that he believed in me and he wanted to help me achieve my goal of being a good father. He empowered me to seek the help that I was looking for. The credibility of the shared lived experience ushered me into action. I began dealing with my depression, dealing with my PTSD with a mental health counselor. I began to take mental health medication to help me cope with life. He helped me find employment and taught me how to face my past with humility. I had the support and guidance I was seeking all my life. There were many people that crossed my path during this time. Up until that point in my life, everyone always told me what they thought I should do. They told me that this is a way that you can change, or this is how you should live. This particular person asked me what I wanted to do. The most important part of communication for me is to listen. This person listened to me, and he supported me on my path. That was something I never had growing up. I eventually began working for the same organization as my mentor, who is now my supervisor. I started out as a house manager. This meant that not only did he believe in me and that I could change for the better, but I could support others who are also seeking to change as well. After a year of being a house manager, I was employed as a mentor for this same organization. I've been on that job for 5 years now, and I've had many different roles within the organization. My current role is being a mentor for the same treatment program or the last treatment program I went through. I have come full circle. During this time, I've learned to be a father. My relationships with my 3 daughters and 1 son is great. I love them dearly. In fact, I now have my youngest daughter and son living with me. We recently just moved into a home as of Tuesday. As a formerly incarcerated person, I want to say that mentors play a very important role as change agents during the reentry process to society from incarceration. The guidance, support, accountability, and empowerment is key to the transition. Their knowledge about resources and different support groups are invaluable. Mentors are changing lives. I've been in recovery since 4/27 of 2010. My recovery is not limited to the particular fellowship that I'm a part of. My recovery involves getting back into the community, advocating for others to be able to change, and hope to inspire. So with that, if there's someone who comes to mind as you hear our monologues, someone that is similar to us, I encourage you to listen to them. Guide them towards their goal and support their dream. I implore you to mentor them on their journey. Thank you.
Adam Gopnik. For a great many poor people in America, particularly poor black men, prison is a destination that grades through an ordinary life, much as high school and college do for rich white ones. More than half of all black men without a high school diploma go to prison at some time in their lives. Mass incarceration on a scale almost unexampled in human history is a fundamental fact of our country today. Perhaps the fundamental fact, as slavery was the fundamental fact of 1850. In truth, there are more black men in the grip of the criminal justice system, in prison, on probation, or on parole than were in slavery then. This is Coming Home by Danny.
I became a feminist in prison, within a group of men talking about how, when striving to live up to the images of manhood they witnessed growing up, they slipped easily into criminal behaviors and destructive lifestyles. The stories were all unique, but they were all the same tale. Men, and sometimes women, demanding of us something other than our authentic selves. I sat in that circle of men within a high-security prison and listened to how we embraced criminality in order to live up to the expectations of others, as well as our own desires to be stronger, wealthier, more powerful, and commanding presences in our worlds. But I didn't just listen to the stories. I also shared my own. My youthful desires to be cuddly and hug all the other kids, seeing everyone as an instant friend. However, teachers, parents, and other adults warned me about the dangers of the real world and how uncomfortable I made everyone with my instant affection. And a story about how clamoring for Starbright cartoons over the raucous insistence for He-Man from most other boys in my daycare resulted in children glaring at me and shoving me around in the schoolyard. Stories of the severe disappointment and shame when in middle school, nearly every boy and some of the girls I had conflict with chased and beat me. And later, in the karate class that my dad put me in, where I again humiliated myself and him with my lack of ability to defend myself. But also a story of the extreme, and I do mean extreme, satisfaction I felt when in 8th grade, a boy tried to shove my head into a toilet, and I was able to pull his weight past me and smash his face into the toilet basin. It was for me one of those significant perspective shifts, much like the one which happened in that high security prison years later when I became a feminist. I remember the bathroom door slamming open, my heartbeat jumping, my brain freezing, and the smell of bleach and my pungent urine so overpowering in that moment of heightened awareness that I still cringe at the smell of it in public restrooms today. Then a quick and expected struggle as Casey tried to shove my head into that toilet bowl. I'd never harmed this person, not even said a crossword to him, but he had made the similar mistake that many new kids in my school had made over the last few years. From the girlfriend I had for all of 25 minutes in the 7th grade, to the young Cambodian boy who lived around the corner from me. They responded to my quick friendliness with kindness in return. But I was an outcast at that school, and the ridicule and ostracization that followed them led them to redeem themselves in many ways. Casey had become progressively mean towards me, and the other boys cheered him on for it. But on this day, a simple weight shift happened in my favor, and Casey ended up getting yanked towards the toilet and busted his face into the basin behind it. I ran out of there so quickly that I don't even think I zipped up my zipper. And fearfully, I re-entered the classroom, but I could tell immediately that I was expected to return with a wet head or not at all. My fear and discomfort were overwhelming, but I felt so vindicated and righteous when moments later Casey walked in, unsuccessfully trying to stop a nosebleed that he couldn't hide. The teacher sent him away directly, and I walked everywhere that day with a wider berth around me, very different from the one that I was used to. Those feelings, vindicated and righteous, would characterize nearly every act of violence I committed from that day forward. As though I was constantly just getting payback for the wrongs done to me in my youth. And as I added that most toxic ingredient of masculinity, self-righteous violence, one heaping spoonful at a time, the other ingredients seeped in like the small print, unpronounceable byproducts on the side of drug prescriptions. Thickened skin, casual misogyny, sexual objectification of the weaker people around me, apathy, and the violence escalated ever upward. The whole time, I excused it as a tool of the seemingly weak against those who postured toughness, of the working class against the affluent, of the neighborhood kid against the encroaching immigrants. This developing unawareness molded me into the very patriarchal, racist, sexist, homophobic, nationalist shit that socialized so many of those children that made my life miserable earlier. Eventually, I was walking through the streets of Portland, an alcoholic, drug-using, violent teenager with a pistol in his waistband, which, not surprising really to anybody else in the world, resulted in me shooting other posturing young men. Vindicated and righteous. That's how I felt. Even after the shooting, my warped sense of right and wrong was so socially molded by peers, mentors, porn, Hollywood movies, and all the whiny emo BS consumed by men who don't get to control everything in their worlds, that even then, I thought I would be vindicated and righteous. but instead I ended up serving 17 and a half years in prison. Let me digress just a little to say that while I didn't take the time to see it this way then, I received only 17 and a half years in prison because I was a lower middle class white boy in whom the jury certainly saw the possibility of redemption. Were they right? Maybe that's one way of looking at it. But why is it that my white, male, middle-class experience is continually supported with opportunities to change, succeed, and achieve upward mobility, while a woman of color is shot to death in the same town I grew up in, where when she drove away from an authority figure she probably believed would shoot her to death, whether she drove away or not? Did a jury give Kendra James justice? Or was it white, middle-ish class males that again were excused for his behavior in that incident? But I digress. Arriving in prison, masculinity was continually reinforced by those empowered, by the state and by physical force. I slipped so easily and comfortably into this patterned violence and daily degradation. As many of the poor white men I've known do, I fostered the underdog chip on my shoulder, always finding the confidence in others as a reason to dislike and to devalue them. It might have been nice if instead I had noticed the path that put me into prison and had converted to a more passive lifestyle. I don't know if it would have been very nice for me, but it might have been better for society. Either way, I didn't. Arguments and backtalk, sass and fights all landed me into the hole for more and more extended periods of time. Eventually, I was assigned to 18 months of isolation by the powers that be, having elbowed a guard in the face while he was trying to break up a fight between another prisoner and myself. And then I fought repeatedly with the guards inside the hole at Umatillas Supermax prison. In the final 6 months of my isolation, however, a few things happened to me all at once. My father sent me a letter. He was about to go into heart surgery. As a precaution in case he might die in that surgery, he sent me a letter saying the things that he needed to say. My father's letter and its definitive message was a sober realization that I might never see him again, that our relationship might end while I was locked away in a hole so deep that I couldn't even call him on the phone. I also got a visit from my Amma, which is the nickname that we give my grandmother. She somehow got herself from Portland all the way to Salem, alone. And then, while I sat in the enclosed box with bulletproof glass between me and where she would be, she made the trek with her walker through the encaged path from intake to the building in which I was housed, and through the heavy doors of that building, and then past the very room in which Oregon executes the apparently incorrigible. She sat for an hour on the metal disc of a chair, which was the allotted amount of time that we could visit. And she smiled that whole time through the window with so much love on her dear face. We spoke through a phone that I had to hold with cuffed hands. And she looked at me with the same love and delight that I remembered seeing on her face every time I visited her as a kid. Her love had not wavered an iota. And later that week, I received a copy of the handbook she used during a recent workshop on restorative justice. It was the first time that I had ever heard the term restorative justice. And it contributed to everything good that I had done since that day. Those last months in isolation changed me. I mean, I still got into fights after I got out of the hole. But the erosion of my facade and the built-in toxicity was underway. To put it in the most simplest terms so simple that their complexity makes their meaning indescribable, I found love. honest, vulnerable, heartbreaking love. Between facing my father's death, my Anna's sincere, unwavering compassion, and the perspective-shifting ideas I devoured in that restorative justice workbook, my heart grew 3 sizes. Fast forward 7 years, and I was sitting in a room full of people whose stories and experiences of the tyranny of masculinity connected us so intrinsically that I loved each of the folks there. Much like the stories that we are hearing today and the feelings that I'm having for these people in this room brings love deep into my heart. That group in prison started when a few other prisoners and I, with the help of our chaplain, created a restorative justice group interested in developing empathy for the many people and communities affected by our crimes, including ourselves. It was there that we began to dissect gender normativity, toxic masculinity, and systems of oppression. At the center of all the heartache and destruction we had caused and experienced is oppression, patriarchy, the criminally capitalist social systems, and the racial, class, and gender warfare we perpetuate in all institutions. It was alive inside prison, where I had heard people talk about it and saw it in my own life around me, in who got what jobs, who lived in what housing pods, and who was searched on a regular basis. It was evident in the way I, a young white boy, was sentenced to 17 and a half years after shooting 2 people in the streets and killing one of them. And sure enough, it was rampant in the world that I re-entered after those 17 and a half years. I left prison 2 months after Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson. A year and a half before corporations and their government once again destroyed and dishonored the land of First Nations peoples, brutalizing them on their own territory. 2 years before laws shoved transgendered folks out of bathrooms, and before Brock Turner was, while the nation watched, given the shortest ever slap on the wrist timeout for raping a woman in a parking lot. And 3 years before a racist, tax-evading rapist was put into our White House. I'm not political about it at all. I became a feminist in prison because that is the only thing that makes any sense if we are going to see everyone become free of these injustices. And yet, I walk through this town, a convicted killer, having been more violent in my lifetime than almost any people I know. And I never feel uneasy. Nearly all of the spaces here in Portland were built for me to occupy and feel comfortable and safe within them. And maybe that's why a jury only gave me 17 and a half years. They knew I would be welcomed back without a hiccup, able to earn a bachelor's degree and get a job, to rent a house or a room, and to be able to speak to a crowd full of strangers. If they were right, does this mean that the system is working? Or would we be righteously vindicated in bringing it all down? Thank you.
Michelle Alexander, who is more blameworthy? The young black kid who hustles on the street corner selling weed to help his mama pay rent? Or the college kid who deals drugs out of his dorm room so that he'll have enough cash to finance his spring break? Who should we fear? The kid in the hood who joined a gang and now carries a gun for security because his neighborhood is frightening and unsafe? Or the suburban high school student who has a drinking problem but keeps getting behind the wheel of a car? Piper Kerman. 200 women, no phones, no washing machines, no hair dryers. It was like Lord of the Flies on estrogen. We will now hear from Judy with the Reader's Digest condensed version of my adventures.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to share my condensed version into my many incarcerations and my final reentry into being a contributing member of society. I always felt like I had the ideal childhood and no reason for falling to the wayside. I had a picture-perfect upbringing with loving, doting parents who took every opportunity to shower me with affection and guidance. I grew up on a 100-acre farm southeast of Portland in Colton, Oregon. I was a church-going, straight-A student until I hit puberty, and the 60s swept me up in a current of protests, free love, and of course the drug scene. I was on top of the world. My parents never told me any of this fun stuff. I was having a ball, but my family was having a cow. I couldn't understand why, when I was 14, they refused to allow me to go to LA with my 16-year-old boyfriend for a couple of months while he was working with friends of ours who were a few years older. So against their wishes, instead of going to school, I went to check out California. At that time, I was barely attending school anyway. I was too busy stealing cars and partying. Without even packing a change of clothes, my boyfriend, another friend, and I stuck out our thumbs, and away we went on our exciting journey. After a couple of months of a lot of fun and more than a few scary situations where my life was in danger, I was more than ready to go home. But before I could hitchhike back, I was picked up by the police as a runaway. And this was my formal introduction to the Department of Justice. My parents flew me home, and I didn't even say thanks. Does this mean that I learned my lesson? Of course not. I was just getting started. My thoughts were I was grown. At the age of 16, I got married and had a couple of kids. My husband was extremely abusive, both physically and emotionally. For the first time in my life, I realized that I was not that grown at all. Square as they were, Mom and Dad did know a little bit about life after all. During this period, about 3 years, I didn't use drugs or commit many crimes, just a little shoplifting here and there. My husband never had a job the entire time we were married. Our fantasy was that love would pay the bills. That was awfully mature thinking, when you think? We thought so at the time. We split up several times, but the final time came when I had met someone new and was able to end that first relationship for good. Little did I know that I was going straight from the firing pan into the fire. In no time at all, I was pregnant again. It seemed like I was always pregnant. I married my second husband when I was 7 months along, only because he seemed frantic about not wanting to have an illegitimate child. After my third daughter was born, the physical abuse became so severe that my cousins intervened. They wrestled my husband into a car one day, took him to the airport, and sent him to his sisters, who lived in Hawaii. I never saw him again. My youngest daughter was barely a year old. Here I was, alone again, but now with 3 young children and not a clue what I was going to do. After that, I made a decision that I would never again be a punching bag for any man. The days of walking on eggshells and cowering in corners were gone. I was raised in a family who believed men didn't put their hands on women. It was such a foreign concept that it was never even a topic of discussion. In fact, society itself had not yet conceived the phrase domestic violence. Somewhere along the path of 2 failed marriages, my common sense had flown straight out the window, if I ever had any to begin with. I was 21 and I felt I had finally figured out the solution to a successful relationship. Instead of running like the devil was breathing down my neck at the first inkling of violence, I came up with this brilliant solution. If a man ever again raised his hands to strike me, I would fight back with everything I had within me. As you could probably imagine, Hell's Gates opened wide and swallowed me whole. As a high school dropout, I couldn't find a job that paid the bills. Rent, food, and paying for a babysitter for 3 young kids wasn't cheap, even in the 70s. That was also my excuse for the choices I made. While drugs and alcohol were an escape in the beginning, they soon became a necessity. Since a paycheck wasn't going to cover the bills and a heroin habit, I soon resorted to the better-paying criminal enterprises. I was young, sweet, privileged white woman who could get away with everything and then some, just by batting my sweet baby blues. The world was my oyster. Little did I realize that my oyster would soon turn out to be the penitentiary. Up until that time, I was just getting short county stints, and then on my 6th and 7th felony convictions, where the judge even apologized, stating he had no alternative but to sentence me to prison. And since once wasn't enough, I needed to see if things worked out differently in other states. It turns out they do. They get worse. Every time I went back to prison, I ended up with more time. Also, through my continued visits in and out of jails and prisons, I lost custody of my 2 oldest kids to their father, my first husband. I was devastated. And honestly, I couldn't figure out what my problem was. Sadly, I kept looking for a solution at the bottom of a bottle and through a needle in my arm. The only time I was clean and sober is when I was locked up. Treatment was just becoming available at this time, which wasn't much beyond AA, or they had a single methadone clinic here in Portland at the Henry Building downtown, or at Dixon's Pharmacy in Southeast Portland. Those didn't include counseling in the early years either. The reasons behind criminal behavior weren't yet a topic. Throughout this madness, I somehow managed to keep custody of my youngest daughter, Jackie, who's sitting right over there. That was probably because her stepdad retained steady employment, staying out of the justice system despite his drinking and drugging. Plus, we hadn't heard a word from her biological father since he left. I had always thought we did fairly well when it came to parenting, but I guess that's a lie addicts often tell themselves to avoid having to face their guilt and the reality of the shit show that their life really is. Since I was a thief and a forger, we had to look the part of the normal family. It always seemed as though Jackie was rather well adjusted. She was very outgoing, made friends easily, and was popular in the neighborhood and at school. It never occurred to me that my lifestyle had affected any of my children so adversely until they were well into their adulthood. Recently, I've considered, through my daughter's urgings, to explore how this became my life story. It seems unbelievable I was so blind when I now recall all the violence and drama that accompanies such a dysfunctional lifestyle of criminality and addiction. Come to think about it, I shouldn't have been so surprised when my 2 younger daughters would also spend time in prison themselves. In a sick and twisted way, I even cherish the idea that we now had something that would enable us to bond and relate to one another through shared trauma. This is the first time that I've ever admitted this to anybody, and I'm still trying to understand what it is that I'm attempting to describe. It certainly isn't pride, and I'm definitely not boasting about the 3 of us and our prison experiences. Time is relative. In a day-to-day life in society, time passes in the blink of an eye. Days float by without much thought. In prison, time screeches to a halt. You honestly feel each and every tick, ticking by excruciatingly slow. It felt like the following day would never arrive and that a release date was in the next lifetime. My daughters and I now shared this exact same horror, for that is what it was. We could look at one another in the eyes and know that we have all 3 faced this devastation, holding one another with compassion and understanding of life and hell, and how precious freedom can be. It changes a person, sometimes for the better, more often for the worst. I am grateful to have found a bridge that I hadn't yet burned. I haven't used heroin in over 20 years, and my last drink was October 1st, 2006. I'm truly blessed to have the opportunity to repair and rebuild some of the wreckage I've inflicted on my family and my community and myself for way too many years. To salvage these relationships I so cherish, and I'm happy to say it's still a work in progress. I would like to leave you with these final thoughts. The public is persuaded to believe that tougher, longer sentences will reduce crime. This is a common theme for many candidates running for office. What they don't mention is that the rate of recidivism is continually increasing despite the tough on crime approach. According to a recent CNN interview with Democratic Senator Dick Durbin and Republican Senator Chuck Grassley, recidivism rates have soared for people who are released from correctional institutions. 68% reoffend within 3 years, and 77% of them return to prison within 5 years. Well, that's clearly not solving the problem, is it? These senators are heading a bipartisan effort for justice reformation. If our country is willing to spend enormous amounts of taxpayers' money on mass incarceration, shouldn't those dollars be put to better use? Like, take that money and include a comprehensive evaluation for each person entering the prison system to determine the underlying reasons why they came in contact with the justice system in the first place. We need to increase that individual's chances for a successful reentry back into society by offering drug and alcohol treatment, mental health and treatment for trauma, vocational and educational programs, and basic life skill training, as so many individuals have been born into dysfunction. These things are necessary to combat the revolving doors of our jails and prisons. We learned the skills that sent us to prison, and now we need to be taught new skills to maintain our freedom. That should not be so hard for our society to understand. Thank you.
Elsner, with 2 million people behind bars, it is worth asking what America gets for its money. It is hard to argue that the imprisonment of hundreds of thousands of people for nonviolent drugs possessions offensive was cost effective. In the early 1970s, when the war on drugs began, it cost around $110 million a year. President George W. Bush's fiscal year 2003 budget proposed $19.2 billion to fight drugs. And the drugs trade continues unabated. From Rumi, become the sky, take an axe to the prison wall, escape. A Mexican proverb, they tried to bury us. They didn't know that we were seeds. Our final piece of the day is Long Time Coming from Jackie.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to tell you a story about a little girl bouncing around from place to place, never landing anywhere for too long, encountering different degrees of stress and trauma, all at a toxic level, and how those experiences shaped my existence. My story is about heartbreak, loss, and grief, but also about triumph, healing, and redemption. It's about how God can make miracle out of messes, and how he can transform your pain into your passion. I was born into this life to two people swimming in the midst of their dysfunction. My mom, having escaped a torrential and extremely violent relationship, and my father, trudging through a murky abyss of grief, having been dealt the blow of losing both parents to a senseless tragedy not many years before. Everything my father hated in life, he became. And with the odds stacked against their relationship, it's not hard to see how my parents didn't make it through the storm. They split before I got a good chance to know the man that brought me into this world. And sadly, God would call him to rest before that glorious day I would get a chance to stand before him as his only child and say, God, I love you, and thank you for what you've done to bring me into this world. More importantly, I would say to him, I forgive you. Because of my own lived experience, I can truly identify how trauma can impact who we are and what we become. Thankfully, I still have my dear old mom here, graciously accepting my never-ending invitation to participate in events along the lines of these. Despite me having to beg, bribe, and barter, and sometimes drag her kicking and screaming, I still get her here. And after all that's said and done, through the stress and anxiety of dates and deadlines, we still manage to have a few laughs. And actually endless humor, accented by sometimes bizarre, but entertaining and unconventional spurts of growth, development, and healing. Not many moms would have the courage to be confronted with all that has taken place, especially if it's ugly. And even be willing to put that on display for the world to witness. And our story has so many twists and turns, it's almost a miracle that both of us are still alive, walking and talking, able to share about it, including for me the physical and sexual abuse I suffered, often due to neglect and the compounded traumas of being part of an invisible population of children of incarcerated parents. From a young age, I learned how to maneuver in the trenches of dysfunction and developed an amazing set of skills to survive the politics of poverty and actually thrive. With hustlers and addicts as my mentors, I learned a lot of innovative ways to get things. And though my spirit was opposed to most of that, I felt driven by necessity, and that overrode any internal conflict that may have arisen inside of me. Learning these tactics also helped me dodge many assaults, or distract perpetrators long enough for me to seek safety. In my youth, my criminal behaviors escalated and I began acquiring new methods that brought me a substantial amount of money for a person my age. I quit school in the 8th grade after I was raped, so I had nothing but time and anger to teach myself new ways to get money. When we moved back from Denver, my mom, who had been in recovery since leaving prison, ended up relapsing on drugs. We lost our house and I had to start supporting myself at 15. I lived out of my storage unit for a year and continued to support myself through a life of crime. I always knew it was wrong, but fully accepted that I had no skills to live as a regular person. It's hard to fix a problem you don't understand. In retrospect, I realized that untreated trauma and undiagnosed mental health issues were the cause of many of my dangerous behaviors, including domestic and interpersonal violence. Growing up, watching my mom frequently getting her face bashed in, I created a sad set of boundaries for what I was going to accept into my own life and how I was going to battle abusive people. It's no wonder how I eventually ended up in prison after developing an addiction of my own, which transformed me from the victim to the perpetrator. One of my deepest challenges was going to be how do I mitigate my propensity to blame everyone else but myself, not realizing that if things were everybody else's fault, I had absolutely no power to change. Prison was a traumatic, dehumanizing experience. It was difficult to understand what was happening around me, but I was forced to learn the language and the politics of this strange new world. The institutional lighting sucked, and you could never fully turn it off. The sounds of change and large sets of jingling keys, slamming metal doors, constant chatter and yelling not only disrupts the peace, but also the spirit. Ironically, the prison experience mimicked many of my past relationships that were filled with domestic violence. Abusers, like prison itself, try to isolate you and exert absolute dominance over every aspect of your existence. They like to wear away at your ability to access your support networks with limited expensive phone systems that create barriers for people to keep in contact with their family members. Prison policies are hurtful and destructive. Common practices of public humiliation when you break a rule. Frequent demonstrations from staff that display the power differential. Constant reminders that they're the ones in charge. Verbally and abusive officers and practices that wear away at your self-esteem. The staff was also often rude and disrespectful to our visitors, as if they were trying to discourage them from ever visiting us at all. Along with that, there are constant searches of your belongings, often when you're not present. Can you imagine the feeling you get upon returning to find your things have been searched and spread all over your bed, items tipped over and torn into, spilling everywhere, after a long, hard day shift of working for less than $1 a day? And to top all that off, there might be a disciplinary report outlining your rule violations and subsequent punishment. And all you may have done was put lotion in a shampoo bottle, which they call contraband, or had an extra piece of fruit, which we barely got, or had a set of colored pencils that you borrowed to color a birthday card for your kids, which is strictly forbidden. And it could be that an officer doesn't like you and is harassing and targeting you, pitting other staff against you, encouraging other officers to treat you in the same way. Imagine walking around with the tormented stress of heightened vigilance, being told, sit down, shut up, get away from me. Not being allowed to have any physical contact whatsoever. No hugs of reassurance from peers or simple shoulder rub affirming that we're going to make it out of this hellhole one day. And don't even get me started on the health services. Their practices are horrifying. It truly seems like when the correctional institution goes to hire a nurse or a doctor, Part of their hiring criteria is a total lack of compassion and blatant indifference to our needs. Their practices teach you from the beginning not to come looking for them for medical attention because you won't find it there. I'd like to believe that the public is unaware of what goes on in these institutions, and not that our society's values reflect how we punish. I realize that fear and frenzies often fuel bad policies, but I often ask myself if anyone ever wonders why women go to prison, or anybody for that matter. Does society want people to rehabilitate when they send them away? Why does it criminalize communities of poverty and communities of color? Why is the U.S. our global jailer, outnumbering any other country in regards to prison populations? Do we really believe that we can incarcerate our way out of mental illness, untreated trauma, and poverty? Why do we have for-profit prisons? Why do we disenfranchise people after they get a felony and serve their time? I'd like to reimagine a system rebuilt from the ground up. I want this country to eliminate private prisons and the potential for systems to profit off our prosecution. I want restorative justice and programs that treat the source of why individuals encounter the justice system in the first place. The last time I was in prison, something changed for me. I remember that defining moment as I realized that my daughter was the same age as I was when my mom was in prison the last time. I remember how lonely and confused I was, how sad and desperate I was to be in her presence. And I remember that never fading thought that I had when I was my daughter's age, that if I ever had kids, I would never abandon them this way. That stark reality hit me square between the eyes, and I felt a sinking anguish stir in the pit of my stomach because I had done exactly the thing that I swore I'd never do. Leave my kids in a cold, dark world to fend for themselves. Moments like these have the power to do two things. They can scare you into changing or smash you into smithereens, shredding any spark of motivation and reaffirming any negative core belief that you have within. Thankfully, I had the Lord's loving arms around me to cling to the hope of restoring my shattered, hemorrhaging heart and the possibility of rebuilding the wastelands of my wounded relationships. I began seeking out any and all opportunities to change my thinking, behavior, habits, and friendships. I started with the only available option, volunteer-ran religious groups. There I got the much needed support and healing, and I found people who turned out to be expert listeners. I also learned the effective power of prayer. It revolutionized my life. Although getting into programs while in prison have insane challenges, I developed a set of skills in self-advocating. I also managed to get into drug treatment before leaving, which is a miracle in itself, with only 60 beds amongst a bulging population of nearly 1,300 souls. Upon release, I made every effort to investigate the ins and outs of several agencies, including mental health ones, to see if they could assist me. I discovered many unconventional approaches to accessing services. I've always been creative in utilizing resources, but not quite in this way. With each completed program, I began to feel measurable increments of grief and disorientation slough off as the real me began to emerge. Who was this vibrant and dynamic woman standing before me? What an honor to meet you, my dear. Long time coming. I'm so taken aback that I have been able to defy the odds and find some semblance of peace in my life in some sort of way. One thing my mom failed to mention, because she thinks it's irrelevant, is that her biological parents, yes, she was adopted, had 15 children, and they sold 10 as a means of supporting themselves. Plus, they were alcoholics, we later found out. What unimaginable trauma they must have faced was certainly passed down to the both of us in some way, genetically, and could possibly explain some of the struggles that we both have in our lives. My mom often says I take life way too seriously, that I'm too uptight. I call it being conscientiously cautious. I also know that I could fall off the wagon with any combination of missteps and need to be extremely vigilant about red flag behaviors that would harm me if left unchecked. Since discovering the truer, more effective version of myself, I've been able to accomplish quite a few things. After living in a shelter for 4 months, I was able to get housing and my three kids back. There, the real work had to begin. I got all of us in counseling, something that I was always taught to never trust the system. It was an extremely hard barrier to overcome, how to trust again, or how to trust in the first place. And me and my children have to work constantly towards healing. And I've done a great deal of maturing alongside of them. I can proudly say I've got 3 high school graduates. I was also able to get state certified as a peer mentor through the Oregon Health Authority. With the extent of my legal history, it's unimaginable that I could get state certified for anything. But I come to find out that our lived experience is one of the most valuable things we can offer to the next person who's struggling or trying to find recovery for themselves. And with this certification, like some of these people back here, I can work in treatment centers. I'm also certified to work with youth and young adult, and I can even work in correctional facilities, if you can imagine that. I have a friend who's a peer mentor who works in a county jail. Also, I'd love to work in any of those capacities, but for now I've chosen a career in the trades, and I'm currently working as an electrician with the IBEW, where I'm an active union member learning why organized labor is important. I'm also on the advisory board of the Oregon Justice Resource Center, a nonprofit organization that fights for justice system reform. I've been invited back to the prison several times to share my testimony and provide information about reentry. In addition to that, I do a lot of volunteering and outreach for organizations who are part of my success story, such as Red Lodge Transition Service, who helps Native Americans inside the prison and returning back to the community from prison, and Mercy Corps Reentry Transition Center, another remarkable reentry organization. Also, supported by Southeast Works and the Prisoner Reentry Program, I was able to complete Constructing Hope, which is a pre-apprenticeship program that target minorities and people with legal histories to find careers in the trades. Through all of this, one of the most useful things I've been able to learn is the transforming power of volunteering and how it helps me, not just others. I also learned the simple thing known as how to ask for help, which was a foreign concept to me and truly uncomfortable to me, to not be able to provide something back to someone when I ask for something. If I explain that right. I'm still getting used to this one, asking for help. Well, you've heard some pretty amazing things from some pretty amazing people here this afternoon. My question to all of you is this. What have you heard today that will compel you to take action, to partner with us, and keep the positive momentum in our lives flowing in the right direction? You have heard how we have fought upstream and went through incredible feats of self-discovery. What might you be willing to offer us in the way of advice, mentoring, or other opportunities? We have a reception after the performance where if you're able to stay, please come shake a hand, meet a friend, and invite us into your lives. We are your neighbors. Thank you.
Yes, well, introduced her at the beginning, Carol Imani, who was responsible for all of this and so devoted.